Velrath Station had been designed by a committee, which explained everything about it. The corridors that turned at angles slightly too sharp for comfort, the lighting that committed fully to neither warmth nor efficiency, the diplomatic wing's ventilation system that produced, at irregular intervals, a sound not unlike a large animal reconsidering a decision. Daniel had spent 11 days in this wing and had developed the specific tolerance for institutional ugliness that comes from having no alternative. His quarters were beige. The hallway outside his quarters was beige. The lounge at the end of the hall, which the station's welcome packet described as a space for reflection and interspecies connection, was a slightly different beige that someone had apparently felt strongly about. He was on day 11 because the Vaelthari trade delegation had arrived 3 days late, which their attaché had explained was not tardiness, but rather a cultural expression of intentionality, and which Daniel's supervisor had explained to him via compressed message as, "Just smile and don't touch anything ceremonial." He had smiled. He had not touched anything ceremonial. He had sat through 4 sessions of preliminary framework discussions in a room where the chairs were designed for a species with a different relationship to the concept of lumbar support. And he had eaten 3 meals in the station canteen, where the menu listed items by their atmospheric origin rather than their content, which meant he had accidentally ordered something from a gas giant on his second day and had not, since then, fully recovered his confidence as a diner. The Vaelthari were not, as a people, what he had expected. He was not certain what he had expected. The briefing documents had been thorough in their diplomatic language and thin in their specifics, the way briefing documents always were when the author suspected the recipient might form an opinion. What the documents had conveyed was formal, hierarchical, ancient. What he had encountered across the negotiating table was all of those things and also, unexpectedly, precise. They listened with a quality of attention that made most humans visibly uncomfortable, as though being genuinely heard was an experience the species had not adequately prepared for. Queen Lyra had said 12 words to him across 4 sessions. He had counted, not deliberately, but the way you count things when your mind is doing something other than what you have told it to do. 11 days on Velrath Station, and his mind had developed opinions he had not authorized. He was thinking about none of this on the morning of day 11. He was thinking about the transport dock and his clearance chip and the specific relief of a departure that had been approved through every required channel, the quiet bureaucratic joy of a man whose paperwork is in order. His bag was packed with the efficiency of someone who had packed it in their mind several times before doing it physically. He was wearing his departure jacket. He had said goodbye to the canteen, internally, and with more feeling than the canteen had earned. The corridor to the transport dock passed the intersection with the diplomatic residential wing at a slightly too sharp angle, as all corridors on Velrath Station did, and it was at this intersection, at this angle, that the announcement arrived. It was not the words at first. It was the volume, the specific volume of a person who has been maintaining a composed exterior for a period of time that has now concluded, the sound of containment reaching its outer edge. The corridor acoustics, designed by the same committee that had designed everything else and therefore optimized for nothing, did what they could with it, which was to ensure it reached Daniel with full fidelity and no mercy. Then it was the words. He stopped walking. The corridor achieved a silence that had texture to it, the particular quiet of a space that has received information it cannot categorize and has temporarily suspended all other processing. Somewhere behind him, 2 station technicians found reasons to be elsewhere with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for an excuse. She came around the corner with her white skin and her long ears drawn back, and the expression of a woman who had rehearsed the calm version of this moment and had made a different choice somewhere in the final approach. She was still wearing the formal collar of the negotiating sessions. It struck him, in the specific way that irrelevant details strike people in significant moments, that she had come directly from somewhere official. He looked at her face. He looked at the clearance chip in his hand. He looked at her face again, with the sequential attention of a man establishing which of two things was the priority, and arriving, slowly, at an answer he had not anticipated when he'd packed his bag. The clearance chip went into his jacket pocket. He turned away from the dock. She had not prepared for him to turn around. This was the thing that Lyra would not admit to her attaché, or her physicians, or the senior advisor who had been sending her increasingly formal encrypted messages since the previous evening, each one more carefully worded than the last, and all of them, beneath the formal wording, asking the same question. She had prepared for the other responses. She had catalogued them, in the way her people catalogued things thoroughly, without sentiment in the order of their likelihood. Denial had been first. Procedural retreat had been second. The particular human habit of hiding inside process when process was available. There had been a third option she had labeled, in her private notation, diplomatic catastrophe, which she had considered most probable, and had prepared for accordingly, with the specific readiness of a woman who has been a queen long enough to know that most things become manageable once you have decided they will be. He had turned around. She watched him do it and felt, for a moment, that she would also not be describing to her senior advisor something shift in the architecture of the situation. The way a calculation changes not because new data has arrived, but because a variable you had assigned a fixed value has moved. The observation lounge off the diplomatic wing was nobody's idea of a significant location. It had 3 chairs, a low table, a porthole window that looked out onto the station's maintenance scaffold rather than open space, and a beverage station that offered 17 options, none of which Lyra had been able to identify with confidence. Daniel had poured himself something from the 3rd dispenser on his way in, looked at it, and set it down with the expression of a man making peace with uncertainty. The lounge smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical trace of whatever the station used to clean its upholstery, which was, Lyra's nose informed her, not entirely successful. She had closed the door. That had been its own decision, separate from all the others, and they had both understood what it meant without discussing it, which was the kind of communication that Lyra generally distrusted, because it relied on assumption, and assumption was where diplomacy went to die. In this particular instance, she had allowed it. She told him what her physicians had told her. She used the same language they had used because it was precise, and she had no interest in softening precision with phrasing. She watched him receive the information in the sequential way humans received information that reorganized things. The first piece landing, the pause, the second piece, the longer pause, the moment where the mind caught up with the ears and delivered its verdict to the face. He asked one question. It was not the question she had expected, and it was not any of the questions she had prepared answers for, which was becoming a pattern in this conversation that she found simultaneously irritating, and, in a way she was not examining closely, something else. He had asked, "Is the station's medical bay equipped for this? Or is this a we-need-to-make-arrangements situation?" She had looked at him for a moment with the focused attention of someone recalibrating. "That is your first question," she said. "I'm working in order of urgency," he said. "You don't know what order urgency takes in this situation." "That's why I'm asking." She sat down. She had intended to remain standing. Queens did not sit first. It was not a rule that had ever been written anywhere because it had never needed to be written. It was simply a thing that was true. But the chair was there, and the conversation had taken a direction that standing did not seem to serve. And so she sat, with the deliberateness of someone making a choice rather than conceding a point. Because there was a difference, and she was aware of it even if he almost certainly was not. He was aware of it. He didn't say so. The physicians had described the probability of this outcome using a comparison that Lyra had not shared with him, because she had found it undignified on behalf of both of them. Something involving the statistical frequency of a specific stellar phenomenon that occurred, on average, once per recorded century in any given galaxy. What she had conveyed instead was the essential fact, unadorned, and he had received it without the theatrical disbelief she had anticipated, which left her with the odd sensation of having prepared a response to something that hadn't happened. Outside the porthole, a maintenance drone moved slowly across the scaffold on its scheduled circuit, its little amber light blinking with the peaceful regularity of something that had no opinions about what was occurring on the other side of the glass. Lyra found herself briefly envious of it. "The medical bay," she said, answering his question, because it had been a reasonable question, and he had waited for the answer with patience she had not credited him with, "is adequate for preliminary monitoring. Beyond that, we are in a we-need-to-make-arrangements situation." He nodded slowly with the weight of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "All right," he said. She waited for more. There was no more. "All right," she repeated, with the specific emphasis of a woman requiring elaboration. "I'm still working through the order," he said. "Give me a moment." She gave him the moment. The drone completed its circuit outside. The beverage station produced a small, self-satisfied sound, as though it had done something. And Daniel sat across from her in the observation lounge that smelled of recycled air and thought, and did not go anywhere. By the time the station's light cycle shifted from the pale blue of its artificial morning into the warmer register, it used to suggest midday. 3 separate versions of the corridor announcement were in active circulation through Velrath Station's informal communication network, which operated, as all such networks do, at a velocity that made the official channels look geological. The first version was largely accurate, which made it the least popular. The second version featured a ceremonial blade that had not been present and an exchange of formal challenges that had not occurred, and had the narrative momentum of something that had passed through several people who felt the original lacked structure. The third version, which had originated somewhere in the vicinity of the station canteen, and bore the creative fingerprints of someone with strong feelings about dramatic pacing, included a power failure, a backup generator, and an unspecified energy weapon, and had collected in the course of a single morning more believers than the other 2 combined. Daniel heard about all 3 versions from Yas, his contact from the station's diplomatic liaison office, who delivered them in chronological order of their emergence with the professional neutrality of someone reading a damage report. Yas was a small, precise man who had worked Velrath Station for 9 years and had developed the specific resilience of a person who had witnessed enough interspecies incidents to have stopped being surprised by their content and had become instead a connoisseur of their form. He sat across from Daniel in the same observation lounge, in the chair that Lyra had occupied 2 hours earlier, and laid out the situation the way a technician lays out tools, each piece in its place, each piece necessary. "Your transit file has been reclassified," Yas said. "I know," Daniel said, "indefinitely deferred." "I know that too." Yas looked at him with the measured attention of a man, deciding how much of his professional sympathy budget to allocate to this situation. "The Vaelthari attaché has also issued a communication blackout on the delegation's internal channels, which means," he continued, in the tone of someone delivering the actual news after the preliminary news, "that whatever is happening is being managed at the sovereign level." "It is," Daniel said. Yas was quiet for a moment. Outside the porthole, the maintenance scaffold held its position against the dark, patient and structural and indifferent to sovereign-level situations. "I've been in this posting for 9 years, Yas said finally. "I want you to understand that what I'm about to ask, I'm asking as a professional who needs to accurately assess the station's liability exposure." "Go ahead." "Is there anything in the briefing materials you were given?" Yas said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has thought about this sentence before saying it, "that covered this specific category of outcome?" Daniel considered this with the genuine attention it deserved. "There was a section on biological compatibility," he said. "It was 3 sentences." 3 sentences. The third one said, consult medical personnel if relevant. Yas looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of someone quietly reassigning responsibility to an author of briefing documents who would never be held accountable. Then he produced a small data tablet from his jacket and set it on the table between them. Station Medical has flagged your case as a Category 7 interspecies complexity. That's the highest category they have a protocol for. Category 8, he added, with what Daniel felt was unnecessary precision, is theoretical. What's in Category 8? The documentation describes it as situations for which no existing framework applies. And we're a 7. Comfortably, Yas said. Daniel looked at the tablet. It contained, he could see, a considerable amount of text organized under headings that used words he would need to read slowly. Yas, he said, genuinely, how bad is this? Yas had the specific quality of honesty that comes from long institutional service, the kind that delivers truth without theater, because theater costs energy that 9 years of Velrath Station had not left him. It's not bad, he said. It's complicated. Those are different things, though the documentation doesn't always respect the distinction. He stood, straightening his jacket with the small efficiency of a man who kept his movements economical. The Vaelthari have a word, I looked it up this morning, for a situation that has no precedent but also carries no inherent negative value. Their legal framework treats it as an open vessel, something that gets its meaning from what is put into it rather than from what it is. Daniel looked up at him. I thought that was worth knowing, Yas said, and left the lounge with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had delivered everything he came to deliver and had other Category 7s to attend to. Daniel sat alone in the observation lounge with the data tablet and the recycled air and the porthole view of the scaffold, and thought about open vessels and what you filled them with, and whether the filling was something you decided or something that simply happened while you were working through the order of urgency. The beverage station offered 17 options. He got up and tried a different one. It was not noticeably better than the first, but it was different, and different, he was finding, was its own kind of progress. Lyra's senior advisor was named Orvin, and he had served the Vaelthari crown for 31 years with the devotion of a man who had decided, early in his career, that his personal feelings were a resource best left undeveloped. He was very good at his work. He had navigated 3 succession disputes, 2 trade collapses, and 1 incident involving a member of the previous diplomatic delegation, and a piece of station equipment that had never been formally documented and would not be discussed here. He had, in 31 years, sent Lyra exactly 4 messages that used the word unprecedented, because he believed the word lost its utility if overused, and he was, by nature, a man who protected the utility of his tools. He sent her 2 in a single morning. Lyra read them in her quarters, standing at the narrow desk that the station had provided, and that was slightly too low for her, a fact she had not mentioned because mentioning furniture was beneath the register of things a queen mentioned. The first message laid out the legal framework of the situation in the precise, unornamented language Orvin used when he wanted her to understand that he was being calm by effort rather than by temperament. The second message contained 1 sentence, which was, I have identified 3 historical precedents, all of which are from the early settlement period, none of which resolved in a way that current diplomatic convention would describe as cleanly. She sent back 1 word, come. He arrived within 4 minutes, which told her he had been waiting in the corridor, which told her everything about how seriously he was taking this, because Orvin did not wait in corridors. Corridors were for transit. He entered with the composed expression of a man arranging his face professionally, and sat without being invited to sit, which he had earned the right to do somewhere around year 12, and had exercised judiciously ever since. The 3 precedents, Lyra said. The first is from the early contact period, Orvin said. A Velthari explorer and a human colonist on the Meridian outposts. The situation resolved through a bilateral family compact that took 19 years to ratify because neither government at the time had a category for it. 19 years. The documentation was extensive. The child, by the time ratification was complete, had opinions about it. Lyra absorbed this. The second is less instructive. It involved a member of the Vaelthari merchant class, and the outcome was handled privately, which in the records means the records stop. He said this without judgment, in the way he said most things, as information rather than commentary, because commentary was also a resource he rationed. The third, he continued, and here his voice made a small adjustment that Lyra had learned over their years together to pay attention to, is different in character from the others. Tell me. The third involved a member of the royal house, a secondary branch, not the direct line. He placed a small data chip on the desk beside her, which contained, she understood, the full record. It was not treated as a crisis. The human involved was brought formally into the diplomatic registry of the Velthari state as a protected person, not a citizen, not a consort in the traditional sense, but a recognized party with defined standing. It lasted, he said, 43 years. The record describes it as stable. The room held this for a moment. Outside Lyra's porthole, she had a better view than the observation lounge. She had actual space rather than scaffold. A transport vessel moved through the dark on its outbound trajectory, its running lights tracing a slow green arc across the black. "What is your assessment of Daniel?" she said. It was not quite a question. Orvin considered it with the genuine attention he gave things when he was not going to let his attention show. "He did not leave," he said. "That is an observation, not an assessment." "In my experience," Orvin said, "for a certain category of person, it is both." He straightened the data chip on her desk by a small degree, the habitual precision of a man who arranged things. His file is unremarkable in the ways that files are unremarkable when someone has done their work without requiring attention. He has no diplomatic background. He is not politically significant. He has, according to the station liaison, requested the medical documentation in both standard and Vaelthari translation, which required him to file a separate language access form that most people in his position would not have known existed. Lyra looked at the data chip. He filled it out correctly, Orvin added, on the first attempt. This was, in the taxonomy of things Orvin considered worth mentioning, high praise. Lyra picked up the data chip and held it in her hand, which was not something she needed to do to access its contents, but which she did anyway, because there were moments when the physical weight of a thing was its own kind of information. "Make the preliminary arrangements," she said. "Nothing formal, nothing that commits either party to a specific framework. And if he declines the framework entirely..." She set the data chip down. "He turned away from the transport dock," she said. "He has not declined anything yet." Orvin stood, smoothing his formal jacket with the small economy of motion that was his version of taking a breath. "I'll begin the preliminary language," he said, and moved toward the door with 31 years of practiced discretion in every step. "Orvin," she said before he reached it. He stopped. "The word you used in the second message. Unprecedented." She did not look up from the desk. "You've used it 4 times in 31 years. 5, he said, with the faint quality of a correction that costs something to make. "As of this morning." He left. The door closed behind him with the soft, pressurized click of station-grade sealing, and Lyra stood at her too-low desk in the quiet and looked at the transport vessel until its green running lights faded into the distance and the dark took it back. Daniel read the medical documentation in the order it was given to him, which was the Vaelthari translation first, not because he could read Vaelthari, but because the language access form had delivered it that way, and he had decided, in the specific mood he was in, to treat this as information rather than inconvenience. The characters were unlike anything in standard script, elongated and recursive, looping back on themselves in ways that suggested a written language developed by people who thought about time differently than he did. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned to the standard translation, which was 47 pages and had been produced by the station's automated linguistic system, a fact that became apparent around page 6 when it described a Vaelthari physiological process using the phrase, the body's interior scheduling, which was either a very poor translation or a very accurate one, and he genuinely could not tell which. Page 19 contained a diagram. He studied it with the focused attention of a man who had been an engineer before he had been a diplomatic liaison, and who still, when presented with a system he did not understand, looked first for the load-bearing components. The diagram was, in its way, clarifying. It was also, in a separate and unrelated way, the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen rendered in standard medical illustration format, and he sat with that for a moment before turning to page 20. He was on page 31 when his communicator signaled an incoming message from an address he didn't recognize, which resolved, when he opened it, into a formal header in Vaelthari script, followed by standard text that identified the sender as the Office of the Senior Advisor to the Crown, and described itself as preliminary documentation for his review, non-binding, requiring no immediate response. He read it twice. Then he set the communicator down on the table next to the medical documentation and looked at the porthole, where the maintenance scaffold continued its structural existence without comment. The documentation from Orvan's office was 12 pages. It used the word framework 9 times, the word arrangement 7 times, and the word binding 0 times, which he understood was deliberate and was its own kind of message. It described a category of recognized diplomatic standing that had existed in Vaelthari legal tradition for a very long time and had been used, the document noted with careful understatement, in a small number of historical situations of a comparable nature. It did not use the word unprecedented. He noticed the absence. What it offered, stripped of its formal language, was a place to stand. Not a commitment, not a resolution, not a 19-year ratification process. A place to stand while the larger questions were still being formulated. He found this, given everything, reasonable. He also found it, given the specific nature of the larger questions, quietly remarkable that a 3,100-year-old monarchical legal system had a category for this at all, which said something about the Vaelthari he had not found in the briefing documents, and which he suspected the briefing documents' author had not known to include. He picked up the communicator and opened a message to the only contact he had outside Velrath Station, who he trusted with something that was not yet a category. Her name was Petra, and she was his older sister, and she worked in atmospheric engineering on a station 3 relay jumps away, which meant the message would take 4 hours to reach her and another 4 to return, and in the interim she would be living her life without knowing that her brother had become, in the span of approximately 18 hours, a Category 7 interspecies complexity. He felt this was fair. She had enough going on. He wrote the message 3 times. The first version was too long. The second version was too short and contained. He felt on rereading, a tone of false calm that Petra would identify immediately and find irritating. The third version said, "Something has happened that I don't have a framework for yet. I'm not in any danger. I'm going to need to talk to you when the relay window opens. Don't tell anyone, including the thing you're about to say to yourself right now about how you won't tell anyone but will tell one person." He sent it before he could write a 4th version. Then he gathered the medical documentation and the preliminary framework document and his cold beverage from the 3rd dispenser, which he had returned to out of a kind of loyalty that he recognized was irrational. And he walked back through the corridor with the 2 sharp angles toward the observation lounge, because the observation lounge was where the day had changed, and he had developed, without intending to, a feeling about it. Lyra was already there. She was standing at the porthole with her back to the door, and he understood from the quality of her stillness. The particular stillness of someone who has been standing in one place, thinking rather than the stillness of someone waiting, that she had not expected him to arrive when he did. Her long ears shifted slightly at the sound of the door, the small involuntary adjustment of attention, and she turned with the composed expression of a woman who had decided, before turning, what her expression would be. He held up the preliminary framework document. She looked at it, then at him. "Page 8, he said. "The clause about language access. Does that extend to the medical documentation, or is that a separate filing?" She studied him with the focused attention she had used across 4 sessions of preliminary framework discussions, the attention that had made the other human diplomats uncomfortable. He had learned across those 4 sessions that it did not mean what they thought it meant. It meant she was actually listening. "Separate filing," she said, "but straightforward." "Good," he said, and sat down in the chair across from hers. "I have questions about page 19. Page 19, it turned out, contained questions that generated other questions, which generated a conversation that moved through the medical documentation with the methodical progress of 2 people who had decided, without announcing the decision, to treat the impossible thing in front of them as a problem that could be understood if approached carefully enough. Lyra answered what she could. When she couldn't, she said so, which was not something she did often and which Daniel understood from the specific quality of the pauses before she said it, cost her something each time. He did not remark on this. He filed it in the part of his mind that had been filing things since the corridor, under things that were worth knowing. They were on page 31, the page he had stopped at earlier, the extraordinary one, when Lyra set down her copy of the documentation and said, without preamble, "You filled out the language access form correctly. On the first attempt." He looked up. "Orvin told you that. He tells me things he considers relevant." And that was relevant. To him, she said, in the tone of someone neither confirming nor denying that it had also been relevant to her, apparently. The light cycle outside had moved into the warm amber the station used for late afternoon, which was a fiction the station maintained with some commitment. Amber light being one of the few aesthetic choices the design committee had made that Daniel had no complaints about. It fell through the porthole at an angle that caught the scaffold and made it look, briefly, like something intentional rather than structural. And he thought about how much of what looked intentional was actually just light hitting the right thing at the right moment. He had heard back from Petra. Her message had arrived during a pause in the documentation review, and he had read it privately, and it had said in its entirety, "I told one person. It was myself. I told myself the thing I was definitely not going to say out loud, and now I have to live with having thought it. Call me when the relay opens. Also, Daniel, are you okay?" He had sent back, "Yes, I think so. The situation has more structure than I expected." She had sent, with a speed that suggested she had been waiting at the relay terminal, "The situation or you." He had not sent a 4th message because she was right and he needed more time before he could answer it honestly. Orvin had delivered a 2nd round of preliminary documentation in the late morning, thicker than the first, which Daniel had accepted at the door of the observation lounge, with the same expression he gave engineering schematics when they were more complex than the initial brief had suggested, not dismayed, recalibrating. Orvin had looked at him for a moment with the measuring attention of a man updating an assessment, then had said, with the economy of someone spending words carefully, "The historical precedent I mentioned, the one that lasted 43 years. He had paused. "The documentation describes the early period as the most structurally uncertain. It also describes it as the most," another pause longer, the pause of a word being selected with precision, "generative." Then he had left because Orvin did not embellish. Daniel had thought about that word for the rest of the morning. He was still thinking about it now. "The framework document," he said to Lyra, setting page 31 face down on the table in a gesture of mercy toward both of them. "Page 8, the recognized standing clause. I want to understand what it requires from me practically. Not legally, I've read the legal language, practically. She looked at him with the attention that was actually listening. It requires presence, she said. Continued, documented presence. It requires participation in the formal processes as they develop. It does not require, she stopped, chose the next words with care, anything that is not freely given. That's a precise distinction. My people are precise. I've noticed. He turned his empty cup from the third dispenser slowly on the table between his hands, a habit he had when he was thinking and which he was aware of and had decided not to suppress. Lyra, he said her name the way he said things he meant without decoration. I didn't get on the transport because I didn't want to. I want you to know that's a separate fact from the situation. They exist at the same time. She was quiet for long enough that the ventilation system produced its periodic sound of large animal reconsideration, which at any other moment would have been absurd. Among my people, she said, that distinction between what is required and what is chosen is the only distinction that carries legal weight. And personal weight. Those are not always separate filings, she said, and something in her voice had changed its register by a degree that was small and not small at all. He signed the preliminary framework document that evening. Orvin witnessed it with the contained expression of a man who had served 31 years and had learned that the most significant moments arrived in the least significant rooms. The observation lounge received this information with its usual neutral functionality. The amber light by now faded back to the blue of the station's manufactured evening, the scaffold outside holding its position in the dark. Lyra signed her copy without ceremony and without waiting, which Orvin noted and did not comment on and would think about later. When he had gone, they sat in the lounge that smelled of recycled air with the documentation complete between them and the dark, outside the porthole full of the ordinary traffic of a working station. Cargo vessels and transit shuttles, and the small amber blink of the maintenance drone on its endless patient circuit. Neither of them reached for the beverage station. The situation had, for the moment, more than enough to fill it. Page 19, Lyra said after a while. I know, Daniel said. You have more questions. I have significantly more questions. Good, she said. And the word carried something in it that had not been in any of the rehearsed versions, and was better than all of them, and was, as Orvin would have noted had he still been in the room, in the precise and economical way he noted things that mattered, a beginning.